We're live.
All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Lego Ask meeting that we've been trying to put together for a while. And we want to thank Mobiquity for the hospitality and the hosting. And we hope you enjoy tonight's talk. I want to just introduce a little bit for the ones of you who don't know and are not familiar with OWASP, what OWASP's mission is. OWASP is an open web application security project. It's a not-for-profit organization which mission is to bring awareness to security issues. And the Gainesville chapter is fairly new. Chris and I co-founded about 2 years ago, and we've been trying to organize and mobilize. We had Joe come to our first meeting and give our first presentation, and we're trying to grow. So if you're interested in getting involved, by all means, just drop us a line. I'm going to give you a little quick overview for people who are interested in security and interested in how to get involved and what about the OS project. So say you're new to security and you're overwhelmed with information, where can you go? So we have a few pointers to people, like the OS Top 10. They have some really nice guidelines that break down most common vulnerabilities for web applications. And so you can go and play a little bit with some vulnerable apps, and we have that for different languages, and learn about vulnerabilities. So if you want to do a little bit of pen testing, what you can do too is use a few of the OWASP tools like ZAP, which is pretty robust and pretty nice, or the Open Web Testing Framework. And those are all available to you for download. So if you want to secure your site, there is some things you can do, and you can implement best practices for security. And so check it out and see what you can use for your framework and your application. So there are also developer guidelines available and code review guidelines. So check it out. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Daniela Oliveira. She's going to talk to us tonight about the topic, It's the Psychology Stupid, and how heuristics explain software vulnerabilities, and how priming can illuminate developers' blind spots. Dr. Oliveira is an associate professor with the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Florida. She received her PS and her MS from the computer science from the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. And then she went on to earn her PhD in computer sciences from the University of California, Davis. Her main research interest is interdisciplinary computer security, where she employs successful ideas from other fields to make computer systems more secure. Her current research interests include employing biology and warfare strategies to protect OS kernels in cooperation with a virtual machine and the hardware. She is also interested in understanding the nature of software vulnerabilities and social engineering attacks, especially how these attacks can be prevented from a psychological perspective. She received an NSF Career Award in 2012 for her innovative research in operating systems defense against attacks using virtual machines, and the 2014 NSF Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. So without further ado, Dr. Oliveira.
So thank you so much for having me here. Thanks, Laura, for the invitation. So as Laura was doing her introduction, This talk is about a paper that I presented at the EXAC conference, the annual Computer and Applications Security in last December, and has to do with how we can understand. Oh, sorry. Is that okay? I'm loud. Okay. Do you think I'm good without the mic or with the mic?
No, we're broadcasting, we're recording, so.
Okay, sounds good. So the idea is how to understand the nature of software vulnerabilities from a psychological perspective and what can we do about it. Okay, so you know this, right? Vulnerabilities are increasing, and recent security reports, they also show this negative outlook, like from the year to the next, you see new vulnerabilities, they are increasing, but what is bad is that you still see the same old well-studied vulnerabilities appearing in vulnerability reports. One example is buffer overflow. This vulnerability has been understood for more than 15 years by the security community. Several papers, textbooks talking about it. And like if you go to security focus, you are bound to find or one per day or at least one per week. And the question is, what's going on? So what the security community does? They blame the developer. Oh, it's the developer's fault because there's a lot of guidelines, there's a lot of papers, there's a lot of textbooks. Everybody should know there's a lot of courses in security. So the developer is lazy. The developer should know security, and this vulnerability should be gone by now. And so why? Why do we still see this scenario? Is really the developer's fault? So in this study, we took a different perspective to the problem and tried to look at the problem from a psychological perspective. And we had a psychologist here in our group. So the human being is hardwired for taking shortcuts. Okay? So it's something that was evolution helped us because our working memory is very short. So we have to be very selective to what we have in our working memory, otherwise we cannot function. So whenever human beings, they are confronted with too many choices, too many possibilities, too much information, we get overwhelmed, we get tired, pretty much like this guy here trying to figure out so many brands and possibilities of the razor he cannot find. And sometimes I feel like that in the supermarket too, like when you see so many possibilities of shampoos or jam or anything, okay, I just would like to have 3 options and then choose. So assuming that developers are humans and vulnerabilities are usually hidden in corner cases, what happens is that security is usually not in the developer's working memory when the developer is coding. Like our hypothesis was that, okay, we think that from what we understand, like we have been developers too, developers are concerned about functionality of the code. They are concerned about tight deadlines. They are concerned about the performance of the code. Given this, and given that their working memory is short, security is probably left behind. So what are our hypotheses? Is that vulnerabilities are actually blind spots in the way that developers think in their decision-making processes. So they cannot see, like this picture, like pretty much like the analogy of a car, blind spot. And then we went away trying to validate our hypothesis, or at least collect some indication that we were in the right path for our hypothesis. So then we did an IRB-approved study with 47 developers. So for those that are not familiar with the IRB, who is familiar with an IRB? Okay, it's pretty much everybody. So the IRB is every institution has like an institutional review board that will check if the study is ethical, if it's not harming the participants. So we sought approval for this study, and we had 47 developers working on 6 programming scenarios. And each one of the scenarios had a classic vulnerability. And we used psychological manipulation in the sense that we didn't tell the developers that we were researching security, that security was our focus. We just said that it was just a study about how developers think. And in this study, we progressively cued developers about software vulnerabilities. So this is the outline of the rest of the talk. So what was the study method? So first we recruited developers by email, and we gave them a compensation through an Amazon gift card. And our stimuli was, like I said before, 6 programming scenarios, snippets of code that exercise a certain vulnerability. In our study method, and also in this 6 scenarios, we had 3 information conditions. So we presented the scenarios to developers in this order. Oh, sorry. Can I get them? Yeah. I'm a Brazilian, I feel like I need to move. So these scenarios, they were randomized. Like each one of the 6 scenarios, like a developer could receive as no information condition scenario 1, or for example, you could receive scenario 6, so we randomized. But the order was the same. So the first 2 scenarios, we didn't provide any information to the developer that that particular scenario had a vulnerability. We just presented, and I'm going to show some examples. And we asked some warming up questions and some questions about what the program did, inputs and things like that, without mentioning anything about unexpected results or vulnerability or security. The next 2 scenarios, we cued the developer. We gave the developer implicit information. We didn't mention anything about security, but we asked, could this scenario cause unexpected results when a user run the code? So we prompted the developer that something might go wrong. And the last 2 scenarios, we specifically said, oh, this scenario has a vulnerability, what's the problem, why developers cannot see the problem. And the 4 scenarios were randomized. We did a pilot study, and the scenarios were presented in the random order, and each developer saw each scenario just once and progressed from no information at all, here, to priming, and then to explicitly being said that the scenario had a vulnerability. Okay, so in psychology we have this concept of dependable variables and independable variables. So the independable variables are the variables that we are manipulating in the study, and the dependable variables are what we're going to discover, like how they changed based on the way that we manipulate this. And what we manipulated was the scenario, 1 through 6, and the condition of the scenario. And we want to analyze how the developers scored in terms of security of the code. And also we had, in the end of this study, an interview, a survey, where we asked the developer open questions about the study and about everything that happened. So again, the goal is to see how this changed when we varied the vulnerability scenarios and the level of priming. And the 6 vulnerability, the 6 scenarios that we use, each one had a classic vulnerability, and one of them had a more recently vulnerability. So we had a buffer overflow, we had time to check to time to use vulnerability, and please let me know if you guys are not familiar. Who is not familiar with a buffer overflow? Okay, what's your name? Alex, and you too, right? And what's your name? Bjorn. Okay, so a buffer overflow is the following. The way our operating systems, the way our systems are architected, usually control data is placed adjacent to data. So, for example, when a program is loaded into memory, so this represents the stack, and the stack is the abstraction of functions, right? So every time we invoke a function, the program, the code of the program, will place the return address on the stack, so that when the function returns, the program knows where it should go, okay? But also on the frame for a particular function, we have not only the return address, but we might have a space where a buffer is allocated. For example, a string, a char array, and what attackers can do is to provide an input to a program that overflows the buffer and like a craft input and writes into the return address a malicious address. So when the program returns, we say that the program got hijacked because the program goes to another place. Okay. The other one is time to check to time to use. Are you guys familiar? Who is not familiar with time to check?
I don't know that one.
Race condition?
Okay. Yes, very good. Has
Okay,
to
that's
do
good.
with a race condition. Okay. So, for example, this picture here is not very clear because it was like a small example. But imagine. So let me give you an analogy of the time to check to time to use. Imagine that Laura is an artist and she sells paintings. Okay. And I just come to her studio and I say, oh, I want to buy this art and it's $1,000. And then she said, okay. And then I give her $1,000 in cash. And then she said, fine, I'm going to go to my office and write to you a receipt. While Laura's go there, I just grab $200 out of the cash that I had given her and pocket. And she comes, she gives me the receipt, and she thinks that everything's fine. Okay? So this can happen with programs because of the way operating systems work. Programs work in processes. They work in an interleaved fashion. Okay? So what can happen is that a process may, when a process is opening, trying to open a file, it may check that it's okay for that process to open a file, but then that process gets out of the CPU, and then another malicious process tries to create a malicious alias for that name of the file to point to another file that was not supposed to be accessed. But the permission was given, pretty much like Laura said, okay, you bought, and then the attacker is able to access a file that was not supposed to access. SQL injection?
No,
Is familiar?
Yeah.
I think everybody here is familiar with it. Brute force password cracking, it's pretty much the developer trying dictionary attacks to try to discover valid passwords. Cross-site scripting, I think everybody here is familiar. And the last one, this one is going to be my running example, so I'm going to describe in more details, is the Python SSL vulnerability. This one, all of them are classic and old. The Python SSL is more recent. And if you have any questions, please stop me, like it's just a conversation. Okay, so the SSL protocol, so who is here is not familiar with SSL protocol? So everybody's familiar? Okay, good. So the problem with the Python SSL vulnerability is that, so if everybody's familiar, I can just jump here. The function that opens an SSL client socket does not check the certificates. Okay? And usually the developers don't know about that. And of course, they think, okay, this is a function that is called wrap socket, and this is a function in Python that I should use to open my client socket, so I assume that it should check the certificate, right?
That's Python. Jeez.
It's a bug, right?
Yeah.
You can call a bug or a vulnerability, yeah. I think it's both, right?
Yeah.
Like the Python,
They didn't design it that way.
the API developer could say, no, it's not a bug because my requirement for this function is that I would leave the check to the developer. You know, I think it's more like depends. I think it depends on the specification, right? And it's vague. Like if the specification doesn't say much, the specification says it should go according to the SSL protocol and do this, and this, and this. It's a bug. If the API designer assumes that, okay, I'll provide some of the functionality, but I'm assuming that the developer will need to include code that will check the certificate, is a vulnerability. It's a fine line, right? So this is one of the examples of the scenarios that we gave to our developers. So it's just a small snippet of code, and we provided to the developer all the background. Like, we even discussed what the SSL protocol is about. And as you can see, the developer didn't need knowledge of Python to do that. As long as the developer understood what the SSL protocol is about, it could figure out what's going on here. That's trying to open a connection, okay? And it's even passing a certificate has a parameter, a path to a certificate file as a parameter. So the developer probably thinks that the certificate is going to be checked. And then we ask the developer a few questions. So if the developer received the scenario in the control condition where they didn't have any information, we pretty much trick the developer, just ask noisy questions, warm-up questions. The developer thinks, duh, this is stupid. Is the user input, what's the user input, what happens? But we also ask the developer to work on the code. We gave each scenario, the developer needed to do a small task in the scenario. What our goal here, we are hoping that the developer that actually knew the vulnerability and correlated to the scenario, while doing this task, would also fix the vulnerability. Just like pretty much like if you're giving maintenance to a code and you see that, oh, this is wrong, this code that like somebody else wrote, but I need to add something and I see that something wrong, you just fix. So you're hoping that if the developer understood the vulnerability, it will fix. So that was the whole point of this small task. With the priming condition, where we prime the developer, we gave all these questions, but in the end, we asked, could a developer experience unexpected results when running such code? And what could be examples of these unexpected results? So we didn't explicitly set security or attacks or malicious, but we cue the developer about that something might go wrong or unexpected, not wrong, unexpected, something that you haven't thought when you were coding or analyzing this. And the developers that got this scenario in the explicit condition, we explicitly said this code has a vulnerability that allows attackers to violate the security policies of the web application. And can you pinpoint the problem? Please describe where it occurs and why do you think developers have problems pinpointing this problem. So each developer wrote their answers in an open-ended fashion, it was not multiple choice. And we graded this independently, so 2 researchers graded the answers from all the developers, and we gave 0 if it was completely wrong, we gave a partial if it was kind of getting there, and 2 if it was correct. We also, in the end, when they finished everything, we had a debrief where we asked if the questions was clear, if they were suspicious, and at which point they got suspicious about the goal of this study, the effect of priming on them, and if this changed their security mindset at all. We also asked about their security experience, if they had training, if they influence. We asked them specifically the familiarity with each one of the vulnerabilities that we studied, and we also gave like a debrief on like details of each one of the vulnerabilities, what's the problem, pretty much like an education portion of this study. Okay, so this is a breakdown of their occupations. So most of them were from the industry. We had some from the academia, and we were careful to select only senior undergrads and grad students. We also had software managers or software testers, and we had faculty to do this study. And their background, most male, 94% had a degree. Most of them had a 4-year college degree, and 66% of them never took a security class in their careers. We did a statistical analysis with ANOVA. It's a t-test that allows the comparison of 3 types of means, because we had 3 conditions: no information, priming, and explicit. So this is a type of statistic test exactly for the situation. And these are a little bit of our results. So first, the accuracy for the information conditions, and this kind of goes along our hypothesis. So in the control condition, where we don't provide any information, and when I say accuracy here, I'm looking for the developer, for example, that would fix the code with the vulnerability, the developer that would, when I ask about the expected results, he or she would say, okay, that's what can happen. And also for the explicit condition, the developer will say exactly, that the vulnerability is this, and I think that the developers usually don't figure this out because of this. So as you can see, 20% accuracy when they were not primed, like on all the scenarios that they were not primed at all. And as soon as they were primed about unexpected results, the accuracy goes to around 35%. And when explicitly say, oh, this code has a vulnerability, it seems like they completely changed their mindset and they can find wrong things with the code with an accuracy of almost 60%. So this is their familiarity with the vulnerabilities. So as you can see, most of them are very familiar with the SQL injection. I would say not very familiar because around 25% of them were familiar. But like it's the most popular one, and talk to as like I think it goes also according to these statistics here, talk to is the one that they know least about. They also know buffer overflow and cross-site scripting. So this is the accuracy for each one of the scenarios and also reflects their familiarity with the vulnerabilities. So for example, for SQL injection, the accuracy was much higher than, for example, for talk to, just because the developers knew more. So this shows that knowing or like education kind of have an effect. But what I thought was very interesting is how they apply previous knowledge. So, for example, we had the information in the end. Suppose that, what's your name? You.
Yes, Grant.
Grant.
Yes.
So suppose that Grant took the study and in the end he said that he knew, for example, buffer overflow and cross-site scripting and talk to. So we knew, for each one of the developers, we knew which vulnerability they said that they were familiar with. So then we looked for cases where that particular developer knew the vulnerability. So for example, suppose that Grant says, oh, I know buffer overflow, the debrief. Yeah, I'm familiar with this vulnerability. But then when you looked at the buffer overflow scenario, we noticed that Grant did not correlate the scenario with the vulnerability, even though he knew about the buffer overflow, he read about this before, but when the situation was presented to him, he didn't correlate. So this happened for 53% of the developers. They knew the vulnerability, but they were not able to correlate. And this is the breakdown for the case. Like most of them didn't recognize the brute force scenario. Like for sake of time, like I don't have time to go over all the scenarios, but like this was the most like scenario that they couldn't correlate. Another thing that happened is that the developer knew the vulnerability, the developer correlated, but the developer didn't fix when it had a chance. Remember that each scenario had a small question asking to do something on the code. So you get a code, suppose you're giving maintenance to your code, you see that this code has a buffer overflow, but you add whatever you are asked to add, but you don't touch the problem, like you leave the problem there. So this happened for 36% of our developers, and buffer overflow was one of the most popular, buffer overflow and SQL injection. So here is the effect of priming. So, and all this information came from the debrief survey. So most of them were not suspect of finding vulnerabilities. when they were asked about unexpected results, 60% of them said that it had an effect on the way that they were approaching the problem. And when we explicitly mentioned, 83% said that yes, they changed their mindset completely. And then, another thing that we did, we coded. So this coded here is not in the sense of programming. It's a psychology and social science method when you try to see themes, like when you have, like, for example, an interview, and you try to see themes or categories on what a participant, an interviewer is saying. And what we do pretty much is a manual process, like you read everything and you try to, for example, suppose that I see YouTube mentioning something, so this might be a category, and then you count, okay, so YouTube, and then I start coding more, oh, he also mentioned the same thing, and you mentioned the same thing. So pretty much in this process is called coding. So when we coded the open-ended answers, we saw that 60% of the developers mentioned in the survey was open-ended, that mentioning vulnerabilities changed their mindset. And here I selected some quotes from some interesting quotes from the developers. So this one said, until the words vulnerability and or security were used, I had not thought of security risks yet. We also found out that 60% of them explicitly wrote that priming changed their mindset. And this one wrote, once we were looking for unexpected results, I immediately start thinking of what a dumb or malicious user would attempt to do with the program. 48%, almost half of the developers explicitly wrote that security is not a priority for them. And this one would say, developers look for the most immediate solution to the current problem they are facing, such as copying one buffer to a second and run with whatever solution Google brings them first. So you guys are laughing, so probably you guys agree with what this developer said. 34%, and like when I say coding, like I'm not saying that 52 developers don't agree with that. It's just that it was not explicitly mentioned. They might agree or not, but they didn't wrote. So in this case, almost 0.5% of the developers wrote that security is not a priority to them. 34% of the developers explicitly wrote something that something that means that developers assume common cases. So this one wrote, we usually try to solve the problem for a set of inputs, not for all possible inputs. 30%, security thinking requires cognitive effort. So it's a zero-sum game, right? The time that they spend on thinking security is away from functionalities, time away from performance, is time away maybe from their family or from leisure time, right? So, and this one said, it's hard to understand the fact that the user input can directly affect the execution of code, changing what was supposed to do to something else, like a buffer overflow that hijacks the code and causes the execution to do something else.
It's not hard to understand. It's not hard to understand.
And what I thought very interesting is that they trust APIs. And this one said, it's not straightforward that misusing string copy can lead to very serious problems. Since it's part of the standard library, developers will assume it's okay to use. It's not called unsafe string copy or anything, so it's not immediately clear that the problem is there. And it's also, I think it's a way of liability, right? For example, the string copy, most of you say, oh my goodness, like string copy is so obvious, buffer overflow. But like the Python one that doesn't check certificates, it's not obvious, right?
No.
It's a function that like opens a client socket using SSL, and we assume, okay, I'm outsourcing the responsibility of the SSL to the API. It's the Python API, I should trust that, right? And if there is a vulnerability, it's not my fault, it's Python. Right?
So do you blame the API or your IDE?
Because shouldn't your framework protect you from shooting yourself in the foot?
Well, in that case
Some
specifically, the
Python
because
case,
the Python API says don't use this. They're in a security situation where it says like the defaults are not to have.
So has that bug been removed from Python?
No, it's
not a-
explicitly
it's not a big
supposed to
bug.
be that way.
No, it is a bug.
No, it's supposed like they.
It's not a fine line at all. It's a bug.
No, it's
How
it's
is
a
it
misunderstanding.
Hold on, Jim,
How's it any different than the bug?
Okay. We'll talk about it
It
later.
is-
We'll talk about it later.
I agree, it's a fine line. What's a bug and what's a vulnerability?
We'll talk about it later.
The competition, how's it different than stir copy? How's it different than malloc?
Stir copy has really always been documented to
Exactly.
use it the wrong way.
This is Python we're talking about, not C, man. Python does stuff for you, okay? It's just, never mind. We'll talk about it later.
But from this discussion, you can see that it's a controversial topic, right? Should I trust the API? Like if I'm using a specific, like this guy said, it's not called unsafe string copy. So if I just go in Google string copy and say, it copies buffer 2 to buffer 1 and returns the number of bytes, and if the developer just gets this information, should the developer be blamed? Should the developer dig, and that goes to the cognitive effort. Should the developer keep digging? Okay, I need to use this Python function. Should I trust it? Maybe I should Google everything about this function before using it.
So do you think that this should be something that should be caught in QA or in unit testing, or what's the approach to catch this and not put the strain on the developer? Because I get what you're saying. The business case is make it work yesterday, and it better work quick.
I think something that I'm going to say as a conclusion, I think it's both ways. I think it's everything, but I think that instead of thinking that developers should go for the security information, I think we need to bring the security information to the developer.
That's what I'm about to say. Like that quote right there sounds like a lack of ignorance. I don't know about the risks of using this system at all. I don't understand the consequences of doing this, either fundamentally or in a security context.
Yeah.
This feels like an inexperienced person writing something. That's what it feels like to me. And there's lots of people, inexperienced people writing lots of software. And the fact that they don't know about this it seems like an education problem, not a skills or competencies problem.
But that goes again the education problem, but in the cognitive effort. The developer has the functionality, tasks, the deadlines. Will the developer have the time and think, okay, I need to make an effort to every API function that I'm going to use, I have to check if it's safe. So I'm going to Google everything possible about this function. Nobody does that, right? So I think the security community is trying to change the human or trying to expect something from the human that the human is not hardwired to do. And it's not, I don't think it's going to happen, right? So assuming from a psychological perspective, if we are like that, if we are not lazy, but we are least effort animals, right? If we have short working memories, why not provide tools that somehow bring the security information to the developer instead of expecting, the developer should know that this is a buffer overflow. We know this for 15 years. It's an education problem. Go take security classes. Go open a textbook.
The developers know that they should run the unit test suite that's bundled in with the software that we're writing, but they don't do it and make commits that break tests. This just happens. And so we actually write tools to force the tests to run as they save the file before they have a chance to make the commit. So we do these things, so why not just do it for security too? It's probably harder.
But not all developing environments will have the unit tests, the level of, I agree that education helps. If you take a security, if you go to the WASP website and read and inform yourself, as you can see, all the developers that knew the vulnerability, they scored better in terms of security than those developers that didn't know the vulnerabilities. But even so, you saw developers that knew buffer overflow and didn't correlate. Even the unit tests, developers are coding the unit tests, right? They could miss vulnerabilities are corner cases, so the unit tests may also, remember the idea, it's hard for the human to think about all possible cases.
My point is there's such fundamental errors that we have tests that we know do useful things and we don't even run them before we make commits.
Least effort?
I mean, it's really one command run. Is it red or green? What?
I think,
It's
yeah.
definitely,
One thing.
timeline needs to be met.
Right, and yet, and because we know that's a problem, there are systems designed to make these things happen whether we remember to do it or not.
But for imagine
Something
that,
as simple as that.
do you think a unit test would have caught the Python SSL? This one is hard.
No.
Yes,
Not at all.
because you would have your unit test check a self-signed certificate.
If the test developer did that.
My unit test is
So yeah,
certain
that's
that's
the
the
natural
natural
test,
thing.
write the right test.
Yeah, but it's the natural thing to do if you're testing SSL is to try it.
So right, so then you get a good chance to write security.
Actually use consequential. A unit test would not have caught a stir copy overflow.
Yeah, you just outlaw the use of C because, you know, you're not doing range check and then you're not equipped to use
Or
this.
change the name of the language to unsafe C, like they want the name of the stir copy to be changed.
Problem solved.
Wouldn't that be addressed with code review?
Unless the overflow resulted in a second.
I think it helps,
Which
but
90% of the
it
time.
would help because in the code review, the developer has the mindset of okay, something might go wrong. Definitely, yeah. But I don't think you can say, okay, code review helps, addresses all this problem. I think it's something that goes in all the areas, like of course education helps, of course unit tests, well-designed helps, code review help. But like if we can have a way to, when the developer's coding, would bring the security information to the developer in a way that's easy, I think it will have great effects. As you saw that the priming, like how the developer changed the mindset. Like if you just coding something and using an API function and then pretty much you get this information, oh, this function is unsafe. You're gonna be careful, okay, it's unsafe. Okay, for that one, I need to check it out. Maybe I should Google more because this one is unsafe. So concluding remarks, and I think you guys already conclude, like it's very controversial, right? This study, what this study shows us is that security, of course, we cannot say that because we just did for 47 developers, like we need to have a much more greater set of developers to like draw strong conclusions, but shows us an indication that security is not part of developers' heuristics, of the developers working, like when the developer is working on a problem, the developer is usually thinking about the problem, not about the security implications of what can happen or what all possible inputs that can come to this function or the API or anything. The developer is thinking about the problem. Programming is a cognitive demanding task. So if you add the security thinking, you are adding to the difficulty, the challenging of the task. And you guys know. Developers usually focus on functional requirements. Like we didn't put some other coding information here for lack of time, but like some of the developers, they explicitly said, we have nothing to gain to think about security. Like I have no economic incentive to spend time and effort in making that small piece of code secure. Like I would be better off delivering functionality, the problem of time to market, right? This is something, it's a reality in many tech companies. Like you win the market if you ship the product. The product can have some bugs, and these companies, Intel, NVIDIA, they know that, and they ship the product knowing that has some bugs. But what they want to do is to secure the market. So there is an economic. So that's why security is so interdisciplinary. So it's psychology and it's also economics, because if companies, if they have this liability, like if they have like strong bars for unit testing or code review or anything, like I'm not going to ship the product unless that standard is reached, probably the situation would be better. So there's a little bit, that's a lot of economics into that too. Security is developer assume common case. So again, I think resonates with the cognitive effort. Developer trusts APIs, and I think this is my hypothesis, it's streamlines attribution, right? If something goes wrong, it's a Python SSL problem. It's not that I'm a bad developer, right? And again, something that I already mentioned, there are no economic incentives for security. For the developer, for the company, so the developer thinks, why should I spend time and energy in thinking about what else, several things that could happen. And I think there's no silver bullet to the problem, as you guys are discussing here. Like of course, if we improve all the aspects, we improve the situation. There's no one aspect, and certainly it's not the developer's fault. Like it's not, of course, education helps, but you cannot, the security community is wrong to just say, oh, we have all the security vulnerabilities because our developers are not educated. If they just take a security class with Joey, all these problems would be gone. So that's not true.
Well, that's true.
But that's because Joey's in it.
Hey, so I have a question for this group here. Does anybody in their testing do fuzz testing?
What's
A developer.
Oh, developer. No, that's different.
That's different. Fuzz testing is part of your testing regime.
What, say it again?
Are you familiar with fuzz testing?
Yeah,
Yeah. Do you include it as part of your testing regime?
absolutely not.
Are you familiar with a product called AFL, American Fuzzy Lock? This is a thing by a tool developed by Michael Zalewski, who's one of the Google Project Zero guys. And what this is it's a source code aware fuzz testing program. So it knows about your source code, it knows about the problems it might have, and you can use it to fuzz inputs to see if there are problems that might break your code, that might cause a crash and therefore reveal a potential exploitable vulnerability. So it's the kind of thing that might be used by developers if they're interested in security, if they're willing to put in a little bit of effort to get potentially a lot of outcome. You know, an automated fuzz testing harness is a good thing. So,
It seems like
something
you
you
could.
could think about.
It seems like you could apply that to SQL injection or other.
Sure, oh, yeah.
You know, just pick up on like parentheses. You know, with some the word MySQL or SQL or
Yeah.
query.
Or just run SQL map against your application.
They give you a little
It's kind of like that.
say, hey,
The SQL map's not gonna help you with second order.
No, it's not, but it'll help you with a lot of stuff.
What is second order?
Second order SQL injection is
It's more of a fringe case where you can do an
it's a corner
input
case.
parameter. Yeah, it's a corner case with a corner case. That's a good way to represent it.
Yeah.
But it's trickier to solve because you can slightly influence the input of one parameter that in conjunction with another parameter slightly influenced together kind of put SQL injection. So it's a lot trickier to find.
Is it possible to do it if the programmer has done the normal correct SQL encoding?
SQL encoding or input validation.
Well, the thing I've always thought about
queries, I mean,
little Bobby tables is that before Bobby ever matriculated, they were screwing up little Maggie O'Reilly.
yeah, sure.
So if they had done it correctly, so Maggie O'Reilly would be handled correctly, Bobby tables wouldn't have crashed their system.
I think
Now,
it's,
would his mom have been able to do second order if they had been handling Maggie's name correctly?
most of the cases that I've seen.
Usually what happens with things like that is when, or in my experience in dealing with second order SQL injection, is something where something is very unaccounted for. Like, oh, you can influence the cookie in one way or a HTTP header parameter, use one of the verbs within there to influence things in a way that the programmer didn't think they necessarily needed to take into consideration. That, as you said, you know, it's difficult to account for all possible scenarios. So yeah, yes and no. You know, it's hard to lock it down. There will always be those fringe
The
cases.
examples that I've seen for secondary injection are they did testing for string comparison or something on some of the variables that get sent to a compare statement, but not all of them, or there's a side effect on a variable based on something else that is used as a variable on a SQL statement. But they didn't know that.
Sounds to me like it wouldn't work if they're encoding it right. The programmer's encoding it.
If they took the final string before the compare and did testing on it, sure.
So
for example, you might
double
double
encoding.
Yeah.
Versus 25.
So you might provide an input that would create a new value that then would be used in a further query, and if
Yes.
you put injection into that new value,
Then,
then you'd be able to use it in a query that happened later.
yeah.
Yes, you can escape something at a later place.
Did you pass this all the way around?
I got to somebody. Has everybody signed up for?
I didn't sign up.
Well, we're in the racket class.
No, it's
Sorry.
No, that's all. Like I wanted to see the discussion. That's great. So recommendations from, like, of course, I just said that's all, that there's no silver bullet. But our group will believe that relevant security information should reach developers when they need it, and not the way around. Okay, so that's another thing of the forgetting factor that's also with psychology. Like you study buffer overflow, and maybe 4 years later you are confronted with the situation, you might not correlate, like what happened with the developers. So our tools need to evolve to be on the fly. The developer like the ideal situation is that the developer needs the security information because they're dealing with a function that has a blind spot, with a function that has a vulnerability. In the ideal world, the security information should bring to the developer when it needs, so that it goes to working memory, and then the developer, oh, yeah, of course.
Well, I feel like an IDE that had a subscription-based security highlighting behind different code types as you type. You know, it's real time, being the subscription service, kind of like your firewall's a bid, can highlight underneath your code.
I think there's a lot that the community can do about it. And again, trying to change the human is fruitless. It's thousands of years of evolution hardwiring, just thinking that the security community is going to change the human, about least effort, our short working memories, the way that we think in shortcuts, just like the developers. I just go to Google and I just look for the first solution that I can find. Shortcuts, that's what humans do. And it's not a problem, like that's the way we evolved, right? And we are just going to be doing a disservice trying to change the human. Thank you so much for having me here. Any other questions or any other? Yeah.
So on one of the slides, like about halfway through, you asked a question, a follow-up question. Did priming you about the fact that, like, explicitly stating there was a security vulnerability make you think there was one? And something like 80% said yes, 10% said maybe, and like I was wondering, what's the demographics of that 10.6% that are saying, no?
Well, it may have been a vulnerability. You didn't say it was.
Oh, this, you mean the 6.4? This one here?
No, the 10.6.
10.6. You want some?
Like, was there a specific? Was that like people like didn't know what they're talking about at all, or like low crotchety people? Like, who are those 10.6%?
That's a very, like, we would need to go back and like ask them, like, because we had the survey and like we act on the information, but yeah. Maybe they didn't have the security education, and like you said, like, okay, no, it does, like explicitly mentioned doesn't help at all, because I couldn't do anything because I didn't know those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, just like 1 out of 10 people seems crazy.
This is like people that have no security mindset to get put into.
Yeah.
There are people that do that, they're specialists and I'm a software developer.
So that, I mean, like, storing like database passwords in code, that are like repos and stuff. Like, you explain to people, like, yeah, this isn't a good idea. And they're like, yeah, you're right. The cost benefit is like crazy toward, like, I absolutely shouldn't do it. And you look the next day and it's still there, and you're just like, I feel like I spent more time talking about it than it would have to take the passwords out of the repo and you leave them in. And I feel like that's the 1 out of 10 people who are just like, yeah, I don't care at all. It's like, okay, I was interested if there was some sort of like demographic on that.
And again, we cannot go back because everything is anonymous, so we don't know. Like, each developer provides information about demographics, but we did it in a way that, yeah, it's completely, like, I cannot correlate with. Oh,
I want names and phone number, right?
That's why we have an IRB, so that's why IRBs check. Like,
You don't want to hire them.
for example, I cannot say that it was you that I actually recruited.
How many? I don't know if I caught that or not.
47.
47.
I'd be curious, have you considered taking the study and doing it as a more long-term study over the course of time, where, hey, you gave them the security warning, prepped them ahead of time. Do they keep with that mentality for a year? Or is it, hey, you mentioned it the one time, they focused the one time, and then the next time they
it's over.
didn't think about it?
That's a very good idea, yeah.
Well, I think you could gather that information from just general, like, learning or education studies, because that's just like how like the extent to which people retain information that you give them. So it's not,
It's not just the information retention, it's the heightened awareness. There was a stress level almost associated
Let me
with.
tell you something about the result on social engineering spear phishing emails. So there was a paper very interesting that they did this study in a corporation, a large corporation, and they gave the employees were receiving ad hoc, random social engineering emails, and if they click on the link, they would receive some training, like pretty much like a Q, like some training. And then after this phase, I think they waited 6 months, and they repeated, and they saw no effect on the training. Can you believe that? But psychology explains that there is a forgetting process. Like if you don't use the information, our brains pretty much wipe out. Like have you guys have children watch that movie Inside Out? From that, no? Okay, so that shows like the brain pretty much. So I have information. So that's pretty. That psychology and neuroscience explains that. So it's the brain actually does that. If you don't use a particular information, it just fades away. So this probably explains the social engineering, and I think might happen with developers. Like if they are not aware all the time of security, they might forget. Oh, what's going on again? I forgot. Or like they might know and they might not correlate.
Is there any effect of agile methodology with in relationship to this? Because typically there is more of a pressure, a time pressure to produce a certain amount of.
So the time pressure is a factor that would make everything worse. Because now you have the time pressure. So now you have to, I have to focus on functionality and the time that I get this functionality out. So I would hypothesize that they would think even less about security.
They only have 4 hours to answer.
Like you have 4 hours, I don't care.
You have to process.
No, but that's the business case. That is the business is about the bottom line.
And that's where economics and psychology goes. Like the psychology where the developer has a short working memory, and the economics that what am I going to gain to think about security? I just have to ship this functionality in 4 hours. I don't care.
Well, I mean, Sony has proved the case. I mean, how have they suffered?
Who?
How has Microsoft suffered? They've been putting out garbage code for decades.
Yeah, Microsoft has done a pretty good job with the SDLC. They've actually improved it. So if you look at their bug rate, it's stayed relatively constant, even though the lines of code have just exploded. Okay?
But Sony made a conscious
They've
effort.
done really well. They've had a corporate thrust in security, and it's been working.
But Sony made a
First 20 years ago.
Sony said we're not going to spend money on security, and it seems like it was a good bet.
Yeah, well, I think the Sony issue is more of a network management and system administration than software development problem.
Yes,
and
it's true.
So you have a point there, and they're not taking that seriously because it doesn't affect their bottom line. Just like it doesn't affect Target, just like it doesn't affect Home Depot, just like et cetera, et cetera.
What you guys say has to do with liability. We'll give you the example of Microsoft. So remember that attacks from the 2000s, Code Red, SAS, all that attacks that involve Microsoft products. So they cause loss of money to several people and several corporations that use Microsoft. I don't think Microsoft was sued. I don't think Microsoft had to pay anything. So it was something, so that goes the economics. Like if there was a liability, maybe Microsoft or other companies would be much careful. Just like doctors are super careful about like anything that happens, they are afraid of being sued because they are sued, they get sued. That doesn't happen with software companies.
That's true, and I think Microsoft's interest is one of goodwill, not of the bottom line in terms of dollars. And they believe that's going to affect their bottom line, but they can't see it immediately.
I think he has a question for
Actually, my question was going to be, what do you think would happen if sellers and renters of software were liable for the costs of security breaches?
I think security would improve because it would be part of you would go hand to hand with functionality, right? Because the corporation would probably make the developer liable. Okay, if something happens and I can trace this to you, like I can fire you, or I can, like instead of me being so I can just transfer the liability to you. I think it would improve naturally. Yeah.
It would improve security. Would it improve, innovation?
Maybe it will delay products being shipped to the market, maybe to delay a little bit within the innovation because they will be more cautious. So is that, and again, that would be another controversial discussion. Like, would be good that like we slow down innovation to make whenever like we have a product in the market, we know that's much better. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Considering what just happened with the SF-86 forms, I think the importance of not having the security defects looks 10 times more important than it did just a little while ago.
It'd be interesting to do some sort of correlation with a physical world product that was in its infancy, like cars initially, and we shipped them without windshields, without seat belts, and things of that nature. And we got to a point where it's like, all right, you got to be regular, you got to at least maintain this minimum security standard. Where was that tipping point where the government or whoever said, hey, we have to have these standards? Are we at that point?
It was Ralph Nader's book, I think. It was Ralph Nader's book, I think.
Yeah. Unsafe it is. Unsafe.
So yeah, unsafe at any speed, Ashley Madison, roughly the same. We'll start to see security now. So, yeah.
There's no doubt there's a cultural element here.
Sure.
In the profession. I mean, we have a long history of completely disclaiming fitness for a particular purchase, and we make no claims for the quality of the stuff, and that's a large part of these Tolstoy-length user agreements. And that culture would need to change at least a little, if not substantially, to maybe make a bigger difference.
But the quality, how to measure quality, then you fall into regulations, and unless there is some kind of regulation or some kind of standard, then how do you measure quality?
Could be done by bonding companies or something like that, maybe instead of regulations.
Well, I think that's a comment. Some of that is a well understood art. FSMA is an example. There's a well understood process to get there. There are tools. Are they good, Cuevas? Are they good? No, it's a terrible process. But there is an understood process there. Maybe that can be refined.
It's a step in the right direction.
Your paper spoke largely to, or it seems your study spoke largely to individual psychology. I was wondering if there are solutions in like larger group and organizational things. Like, is there any idea to look into, hey, whenever we instead of focusing on rehabilitating crappy developers, we outsource it to security, et cetera. Is that an effective way to get around like what seems to be a very long and hard process to educate developers? And
So I'm not sure if I understood the question.
Like as an organization, instead of investing time in individual developers, I hire an OPSEC person. Mm-hmm. Is that a more effective route towards shipping better code, or is it worth investing in individual?
I think it's similar to code review, right? You were mentioning about hiring people that would review things. I think it improves, of course, because when you're reviewing code, your mindset is that something might go wrong. I need to find things that are wrong. So, of course, I think, of course, it improves because the security or the bug thinking is in the mindset of the code reviewer. Yeah.
This actually goes again to Microsoft's SCLC, where they say, hey, our entire software development process has security in it from the beginning. And every project has their security goals. So, but I don't know how you do a controlled study. That sounds really complicated.
Maybe, I think it's a good idea. Like if companies could afford that, that's another thing, the economic thing, right? If companies could afford that, it would be amazing if you could have the development team and like the security team in parallel checking the security and going back and forth with that. But like, can corporations and companies afford that? It's just like doubling your staff and like you still have half of the functionality.
I wonder if you can do a comparison between social media, GitHub, and just mine the internet for the data. Like, what's everybody's?
I think that's a common approach. I know that some companies, they just write code and they produce a product. It's not something that they would release, but before they would, it's like part of their commercialization process. They would hire some third party to do a bunch of pen testing and even multiple third parties because they want multiple opinions. And they say, here, generate a vulnerability report for us. Mm-hmm. And there's like 1,000 things that they just spit out because I've looked at these things. And then.
But that's a point in time shot.
Yeah. Right, it's a point in time shot. Yeah, but
that definitely helps.
But some people already do that. And speaking about security standards, I'm surprised. I mean, aren't there already these guidelines, well, actually not even guidelines, like some of them are requirements, although vague, like I know HIPAA is really vague, and then there's PCI for payment processing. I really am not familiar with that, but I know HIPAA is really vague and not specific.
They're like the NIST guidelines.
Yeah, NIST
or,
guidelines.
The NIST
you know,
guidelines,
PCI.
but none of them are specific.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
They require
They're
heavy
just like,
interpretation.
yeah, they're just like, we should probably do something to address this, but nothing that really tells you what to do.
Is there anyone here that's using source code analysis tools? Things that would like lynch a source code for Python libraries that have bad defaults. I see, warning, you're using a Python library call that has a bad default.
That's not Python, okay? If it has a bad default, that's not Python. So it's a bug.
But I could, okay, Pilot exists. Pilot
exists, I'm not sure
that I'm
why.
doing stylistic things wrong. Pilot could say, just watch out for that library. That's a loaded gun right there.
I think that
Just
exists
so you know.
for operating systems. I haven't used it, but I've heard Spacewalk. I don't know if anybody's used it here. Apparently, it can inventory your security vulnerabilities. Like, the vulnerabilities of the packages, because, Spacewalk is for enterprise Linux, so you're probably using Red Hat or CentOS.
Spacewalk is the equivalent of Cell,
And it uses find bugs and torch-wrench, which are almost source static analysis.
Yeah,
They analyze the Java bytecode with static analysis.
But one tricky thing with like using.
Sonar, I think the company that makes it is Grammet Tech or something.
So SonarQube, yeah, they did sell, and actually we implemented it on a couple projects here where commits run that static analysis and then reject them if they don't pass like some threshold. And there's some very fine metrics about like, well, you can have like
She's shaking me in my
10
core.
bugs. But yeah, it's something that we like because we're client services. We will do whatever the client wants to buy, and oftentimes clients aren't convinced of security vulnerability. Like Target is great for a client services company because when that happens, you can sell security services all day long. But that's 2 months of selling that, and then you get back into a normal habit of like your salespeople are like, it's okay, whatever. We can cut out like the strike through the security line and sell the rest of this contract. I mean, it's largely economic incentives, especially in this like area here.
The issue with the tools, like there are certainly several static analysis tools that can be used to check for, especially bugs. But the problem, I think that one of the issues is that they are after the fact usually. So the developer codes and then run the tool, and that again goes to the least effort thing. Like if these tools could reach the developer while the developer is coding, and like bringing the security, the mindset of thinking while the developer is working out the code, I think it would be more effective. But of course,
Then you teach the developer.
I think you're
As opposed to blocking the commit.
You don't teach the developer, you kill the developer.
Are you thinking of
Sure, that goes back to like the IDE and what's.
Yeah, ID.
I think that's what Agile
Like you were
is
saying, an actual live.
right? The time crunch and the cycles
That's
of
what's
Agile.
great
Like if I'm making commits on every small feature improvement, then I'm not seeing it as I typed in the function name, but I'm seeing it that day. I'm seeing it, within a couple hours of whenever I wrote it. Like it may not be great, it may not be the immediate thing, but I am seeing it as I write it effectively.
Well, there is the fact too that most test cases only account for functional tests and not misuse case scenarios.
That's true.
And I think that has a little contribution there that you're
think so.
expecting the unexpected, even with fuzzers and.
I agree.
Any more questions?
Is there a web archive of your mailing list?
We have, if you go to OWASP chapters, you can find us there. You can subscribe to the mailing list. There are several OWASP mailing lists out there too, and channel. OWASP has a YouTube channel that you can subscribe depending on the topic. There's a lot of information. If you want to sign up for the list, I'll subscribe to you.
There should be another knock on
Yeah.
this one.
Any more questions?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. We wanted to give you a little token from OASP. And we appreciate your time coming. We want you back.
Thank you so much for the discussion. It's great.
Thank you very much. And everybody, feel free to grab little freebies here. We got some OASP promo material, take home with you. We are looking for volunteers to participate in our projects and our chapter. Organize, help any way you want to help. We would appreciate, and we appreciate Mobiquity and Doug for organizing, recording, an awesome job. Thank you so much.
So I just thought of a project for the Gainesville area. We will SEO the hell out of warnings about unsafe APIs, unsafe APIs, unsafe APIs, unsafe APIs.